the theory of evolution and the theory of plate tectonics agree. The theory of plate tectonics is a newer theory. You probably grew up hearing about the drifting of the plates that make up the crust of the Earth since for all through school. But this is actually a relatively new theory. Before the 1950s, most geologists thought that the surface of the Earth was fixed in place. They thought that there was volcanic activity and things were going up and down and wearing away by erosion, but they didn't think that the continents moved or that there were plates that moved. And starting in the 1950s, it became generally accepted that, in fact, the plates do move. And if we look down at the bottom here, this is where the continents are today. And many individuals noticed that if you look at the coast of Africa, it looks like it should fit right here, like a puzzle piece. And it wasn't, though, until the early part of the 20th century that enough evidence accumulated to indicate that, in fact, these continents did fit together at one point. And if we go back, so up at the top here, this was the position of the continents at the beginning of the age of the dinosaurs, about 250 million years ago. And we call this the supercontinent Pangaea, which you probably heard that word before. And they separated. This is kind of in the middle of the age of the dinosaurs. And this was at the end of the age of the dinosaurs. And we have South America as a continent not connected to North America. India, you notice, is kind of off by itself here. Antarctica is a bit further north than it is today, and Australia still isolated. So one of the pieces of evidence that was used to prove the theory of plate tectonics was the fact that if you go back to older fossil remains, you find the same species on both North American continent and the Eurasian continent. And if you could find the same species in South America and Africa, species that could not swim, land animals and plants that would not have been able to cross the Atlantic Ocean. But if you go to more recent species, you no longer find the same species in South America and Africa. And that's always nice too, again, when the geology and biology agree on what has happened. So these are organisms that lived towards the beginning of the age of the dinosaurs. And if you find a land animal, fossil remains of it, in both of these continents, that's an indication that when this animal was alive, these continents were a single land mass and could walk back and forth between those. Another piece of evidence from creatures that are alive today and not from the fossil record is from something that we call vestigial structures. So vestigial, that word is the same root as the word vestige. So if you find an old tool at a garage sale, you could say, oh, this is a vestige of an earlier time. So vestigial structure is a structure that is not useful in the organism in which it currently finds itself, but was useful to an ancestor. So some examples of vestigial structures. So here's a species of blind cave fish. We find many blind species of organisms in caves, as often happens in freshwater systems where there are caves. Species of fish and even crustaceans and shrimp and things get washed into these underground caves that are pitch black. There's very small amount of food available in these places, and these organisms then evolve and survive in these places. Generally, they lose all of their body pigment, and they tend to lose their eyes. Eyes are metabolically expensive neurological structures, and if you never use them, if it's a pitch black environment, mutations that would cause them to lose these expensive structures would be a survival advantage, especially in an environment where food is scarce. So this species of cavefish, it has no eyes whatsoever. In fact, there's just skin and scales where the eyes should be. But in the skull of the fish are holes where the eyes would be in a fish species that does have eyes, in the ancestral species. So in this fish, the sockets in the skull are vestigial because it has no eyes. It doesn't use them. However, they were used in an ancestor. It descended from a seeing fish that washed into this cave system thousands of years ago. Another good example of a vestigial structure is molars in vampire bats. Vampire bats live in South America. They are closely related to insect-eating bats. They're small, like insect-eating bats. They're in the Microchiroptera. And they eat a liquid diet their entire lives. They're mammals. So when they're newborns, they suckle milk from their mothers. Then they move on to a diet of vomited blood from their mothers. Then finally they're off getting their own food and they're drinking blood. So they never chew anything. They eat no solid food, yet they have molars. So you can see in this little skull here, see right here? You can clearly see little molars. So why do they have molars? They're vestigial, and it's an indication that vampire bats have recently evolved from an insect-eating ancestor that did chew their food, and these molars are vestigial. They don't use them. They're not used in vampire bats, but they were used in an ancestor. Some more primitive species of snakes, like boa constrictors, have the remains of hind limbs. Snakes are legless reptiles, you might know. They have lost their limbs, but some species of snakes still have a little toenail here that you can see that protrudes out through the skin, and tiny remnants of bones internally. There is a bit of debate about whether these are truly vestigial. You can remove them and the snakes appear to be unaffected either in mating or survival. However, some people think that perhaps they do use these during mating, so they might not be completely vestigial. Plants can have vestigial structures too. The common lawn dandelions that we see everywhere are actually clones. The flower is the plant's reproductive structure. The plant's equivalent of sperm is pollen, and so the anthers here that you see, the little twigs that you see sticking out, those produce pollen, so that's the male gamete in plants. And the female gamete is tucked down inside of the flower, the ovules, that's the equivalent of the egg. And the purpose of a flower is to attract a pollinator, like a bee. There's other animals that pollinate as well. To attract a pollinator, the pollinator gets pollen dusted on themselves, and as they go from flower to flower, they bring pollen to fertilize the ovules of other flowers. Well, dandelions still produce pollen. However, meiosis does not occur. They don't have sexual reproduction anymore, and so the ovules develop into seeds that are identical clones of the parent plant, and they have no need for the pollen or the flower or to feed the bees or anything else. So the entire flower structure is vestigial, and there is not any pollination occurring in dandelions. Probably the most well-known vestigial structure in humans is the appendix. The appendix is attached to the large intestine. So here in the digestive system, food goes into the stomach, then it goes into the small intestine, then it goes into the large intestine before exiting the body. So right where the small intestine connects to the large intestine, there is this blind sac here, and connected to that is the appendix. And the appendix is open on the inside to the intestinal cavity, and fecal material does get in there. They can become infected and you can have your appendix removed, and it appears to cause no harm to have your appendix removed. People have tried to find a function for the appendix and have speculated functions for the appendix for several hundred years. The main reason being that having a human vestigial structure is a big problem for creationists, because if we are perfectly designed and created, we would have no vestigial structures, because a vestigial structure is by definition a useless structure. So why do we have this appendix? What is the evolutionary explanation for this? Well, there's two kinds of organisms, of mammals, that can break down cellulose in their gut and ferment cellulose. And those are the ruminant animals, like cows, that have a multi-part stomach, and one of their stomachs houses fermenting bacteria that can break down cellulose, and the cows then are consuming those bacteria that ferment. And so they get fatty acids and proteins from those bacteria as they eat them. Other mammals are hindgut fermenters, like rabbits and horses and primates, which we're primates. So other primates, not humans, but other primates like leaf-eating monkeys and even chimpanzees to some extent, have, instead of an appendix like we do, this blind sac is much larger, and it's called the cecum, and it houses bacteria that can digest cellulose. And so rabbits and horses and primates that have a lot of cellulose in their diet, cellulose we can't digest, we call it fiber, that's where that occurs. So that means that we are descended from an ancestor that had a large cecum that could ferment cellulose in their gut with the help of bacteria, but we cannot. We lost that during the course of our evolution. So now when we consume cellulose, we call it fiber because we get no calories from it. We don't have the right bacteria in our gut to break it down. We have no place for those bacteria to live, and cellulose just passes right through. So our appendix is vestigial. Some other human vestigial structures, one is goosebumps. So when you get cold, the muscles that are attached to your hairs contract, and our bodies are covered with fine hair, even though mostly we can't see it. And in all other mammals that are covered with body hair and fur, when those little muscles contract, it makes all of their hair stand up straight, and that helps them keep warm. It's insulating. So we can't do that, but we still have this reflex. So our goosebumps, in fact, do not help us stay warm. Someone even did a study to calculate the amount of heat, and they measured the amount of heat generated by those little muscles contracting to see if it was actually contributing to keeping warm, and in fact, it's negligibly small. Related to that are hackles. So mammals, when they get upset, when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the hairs along the back of the neck and along the spine stand up. Same mechanism, little muscles contracting in the hair follicles. If you have a short-haired dog or cat, you've probably seen this happen. If a cat sees another cat outside, all of the hair on its back stands up. And a short-haired dog, you can see the same thing happen. All the hair on their back stands up when they're growling and upset because they see another dog outside. We have the same reflex. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, our hackles stand up as well, although nobody can see it, so it's useless. It's vestigial. We even still have that saying in English. We say, oh, he's got his hackles up, meaning that somebody's upset and angry. You can feel it, though, like if you've ever been walking to your car by yourself late at night and you hear footsteps behind you and you feel that chill go up the back of your neck, that's your hackles going up as your sympathetic nervous system is activated. Our infants also have a very strong grasping reflex. If you're ever around somebody's newborn baby, they'll say, oh, put your finger in their hand, and the little baby will grab your finger so tight, it's really hard to pry their little fingers off because they're not doing it. It's a reflex. so they don't have control over it. If they get a hold of your hair or your glasses, it's really hard to get their grip loose. And they lose that grasping reflex over the course of their first 2 months or so of life. Other primates also have this grasping reflex. It's vestigial in us, meaning that it's useless. It's very useful, though, in other primates, because in other primates, newborn infants are expected to hold on to their mother's fur as they're carried around. So that reflex was a very good adaptation in all other primates, and our infants still have it, even though our ancestors probably lost their body hair probably around 3 million years ago. We don't know for sure because fur and skin are not preserved in the fossil record for humans. They're rarely preserved ever, but it's been several million years since our infants have needed a grasping reflex, yet we still have it. Another interesting vestigial is the muscles for ear movement. So most mammals can turn their ears in response to sound. If you have a dog or a cat, you've probably seen this. When they hear a sound behind them, they'll turn their ears. So I imagine when your cat is ignoring you and you say their name and you just see their ear turn, you know they heard you. We have all those same muscles, but we can't turn our ears because our head is now too large. But we still have the same reflex to turn our ears in response to sound. Those muscles are innervated, the nerves go into the motor cortex of the brain, and we react to sound using them. Somebody did a really interesting experiment. They put electrodes on people's heads. They told them the experiment was about doing math problems, and they had them doing math problems, and then they dropped something behind them, and whichever side the sound was on, those muscles contracted on that side as if their ear was trying to turn in response to the sound. So it's a very ancient reflex, older even than the grasping reflex, and it's vestigial in humans because we can't use it. If you Google human vestigial structures, the first hit that pops up is wisdom teeth. Wisdom teeth are absolutely not a vestigial structure. They are not vestigial. The reason that about half of people need to have their wisdom teeth removed is because with our modern agricultural diet, which humans have been around as a species for about 250,000 years, and we've only been eating an agriculture-based diet for less than 10,000 years. That diet, we're eating domestic animals, which aren't tough like wild animals. We're eating grains and domestic crops, which are much less chewy and fibrous than their wild counterparts. So we just chew a lot less than our ancestors did, and that affects bone growth. So our jaws are just a little bit smaller than our ancestors, which causes our teeth to be crowded. So for about half of us, when we reach adulthood and our wisdom teeth come in, they don't have room and they have to be pulled. But that's not because they're vestigial. They're absolutely not vestigial. So don't put that answer on the quiz because it will be wrong. We also have vestigial genes. These are called pseudogenes. When they were first discovered, when DNA sequencing first became popular, it was not clear what they were. So because they were genes that were clearly mutated and not being used. And so they called them pseudogenes. Pseudo means false. But we now know that there's an evolutionary explanation for those genes. Those genes were functional in an ancestor, and they have become mutated and non-functional, but they are not false genes, they're vestigial. They, just like for vestigial structures, they were used in an ancestor, and they're not used anymore. One of the things that's happened during primate evolution is the loss of many of the olfactory receptors. These are used in our sense of smell, and the fact that about 60% of olfactory receptor genes in humans are pseudogenes that are mutated and don't work anymore is why we have such a poor sense of smell compared to, say, dogs or mice that still use all of the mammal olfactory receptors. Another thing that we're missing as primates is the ability to synthesize vitamin C. And this is pretty unusual for mammals. Almost all mammals can synthesize vitamin C, Dogs and cats and other carnivores can synthesize vitamin C. Cows can synthesize vitamin C. Primates, though, cannot. And so sometime during early primate evolution, one of the enzymes needed to synthesize vitamin C became mutated and lost, but it didn't affect survival because primates have enough sources of vitamin C in their diet that lack of synthesis ability didn't affect survival. Guinea pigs is the only other mammal group that I'm aware of that can't synthesize their own vitamin C. So we still have the gene for that enzyme, but it's mutated and it doesn't work. And it's mutated in all primates. So that means this was an ancient loss. It didn't happen in the human lineage, it happened in the ancient primate lineage. Occasionally pseudogenes get reactivated. Mutations are happening all the time. And these are kind of interesting. They used to call these throwback individuals because they were like going back to an earlier evolutionary stage, but we don't really think of it that way anymore. So here's a wild dolphin that was captured, and it actually has little hind limbs. And you see that? Dolphins are whales. They're small-toothed whales. And like all the whales, dolphins have no hind limbs. They have a small bit of pelvis and no hind limbs. But here's one that in fact had a couple of tiny hind limbs with bones inside of them. Here's a human that has a small tail. This is actually not that unusual. Now they're just removed, but there are writings, historical writings, that talk about particular individuals as having tails. A human embryo has a tail, has vertebrae that are, those tail vertebrae are reabsorbed, but sometimes they're not. Horses walk on their middle finger, so this middle digit number 3 is the one that horses have, and the hoof is actually like a fingernail. Digits 1 and 5 have been completely lost during the course of evolution, and 2 and 4 are tiny, tiny little slivers up inside the leg. Occasionally, those become full digits, and this is also not that rare. So here's a horse that has one of the digits here, so that would be digit number 2 has been reactivated, and you can see it even has a tiny little hoof on there. Birds don't have teeth. They have a beak instead. But this is a chicken mutant. It's a well-known chicken mutant, and some of the embryos don't survive. But if you look at those embryos, they actually have, so this is the developing beak here, and there's actually little teeth forming here. So that means that chickens still have some of the genes necessary for tooth development. They just normally are used for other purposes or they're inactivated.